The blinding lights of Las Vegas once showcased Paul Williams as an untouchable titan, the choreographic mastermind who built the Motown empire. But the dark secrets of his final days lead far away from the Vegas Strip, terminating in a desolate Detroit alleyway. At 34, the sickle cell-stricken singer was found dead from a gunshot wound to the head. Authorities rapidly closed the case, completely ignoring a glaring forensic anomaly. The fatal bullet entered his left temple, yet the heavy firearm was discovered resting on the opposite side of his body. The shattered glass, the bizarre placement of the weapon, and his sudden financial demands against a powerful record label completely contradict the official police report. The physical evidence leaves behind a terrifying, unresolved paradox. Was the demise of the Temptations' founding father a tragic suicide or a violently staged execution? The humid, suffocating air of Detroit hung heavily over the city on the night of August 17th, 1973. It was exactly 1 o'clock in the morning when the deafening silence of an isolated alleyway on the city's west side was permanently shattered. Sitting in the oppressive urban darkness was a blue Ford Maverick, its engine long silent, parked haphazardly near the intersection of 14th Street and West Grand Boulevard. Inside the vehicle, slumped in the front seat, was the lifeless body of a 34-year-old man. The scene awaiting law enforcement was deeply unsettling, yet entirely predictable for a city grappling with severe economic decline and rising crime rates. The man had a fatal gunshot wound to his head, and a firearm was resting nearby. For the local authorities operating in the early hours of a chaotic weekend, the immediate, almost reflexive classification of the scene was a standard tragic suicide. They looked at the deceased, recognized the fading shadow of a former celebrity who had struggled publicly with alcohol, and quickly closed the narrative. It was clean, it required minimal investigative resources, and it fit a highly convenient, universally understood trope of the fallen entertainer. But when you strip away the convenience of that narrative and rigorously examine the actual physical evidence left inside that blue Ford Maverick, the scene presents a terrifying, completely impossible paradox. The forensic geometry of the death simply does not align with the biology of the victim. The man bleeding out in that alleyway was Paul Williams. Forensic records present a highly suspicious physical anomaly. The fatal bullet entered his left temple, yet the heavy firearm was discovered resting on the opposite side of his body. For a gunshot wound to occur on the left side of the head while the weapon falls cleanly to the right side across the lap raises immediate red flags about the physical mechanics of the scene. It strongly suggests the highly probable scenario that the weapon was placed there after the fact by a secondary individual who was entirely unaware of the victim's left-handed dominance. The physical contradictions of the crime scene only deepen when examining the immediate surroundings inside the vehicle. A heavy glass bottle of Courvoisier cognac was found completely shattered against the driver's side door. A man quietly resigning himself to his own demise does not violently smash a bottle of expensive liquor against the interior of his own car moments before pulling the trigger. The shattered glass strongly indicates a desperate, violent physical struggle taking place within the confined space of the Ford Maverick. Furthermore, the recovered weapon had been discharged twice. Investigators located a second bullet lodged in the interior of the car that had entirely missed the victim. The presence of a second, stray bullet in a confined suicide scenario is a glaring forensic anomaly. A man executing himself at point-blank range does not fire a warning shot into the dashboard. 2 shots signify a frantic altercation, a struggle for control of the weapon, or an external assailant attempting to force compliance. Adding to the deeply disturbing, surreal nature of the scene was the victim's wardrobe. On a cool late summer night, parked in a dry concrete alleyway miles away from any body of water, Paul Williams was found wearing nothing but a pair of floral swimming trunks. He had no shirt, no shoes, and no towel. A human being meticulously planning their final moments on Earth, driving themselves to an isolated location to commit suicide, rarely chooses such a random, highly vulnerable state. The floral swimming trunks paint a deeply sinister picture of a man who was either abruptly forced from his home against his will, fleeing in the middle of the night, or dressed hastily and posthumously by someone attempting to stage a chaotic scene. Every single physical element inside that vehicle pointed directly away from a quiet suicide and pointed aggressively toward a violently concealed homicide. Yet the system deliberately chose to ignore these glaring anomalies. The music industry, the local media, and the investigating authorities were all too eager to accept the narrative that Paul Williams was simply a washed-up, destitute alcoholic who could no longer handle the pressure of his fading fame. They reduced his entire existence to a tragic footnote, a cautionary tale of excess and weakness. This aggressive reduction of his legacy is perhaps the greatest crime of all, because Paul Williams was absolutely not a secondary, disposable background singer. He was a monumental titan of the American music industry. Before the agonizing decline, before the whispers of addiction, and before the dark alleyway, Paul Williams was the undisputed architectural genius of the Motown sound and the visual pioneer of the rhythm and blues aesthetic. The sheer magnitude of the loss inside that Ford Maverick only crystallizes when measuring the creative power Paul wielded at his zenith. He was a founding member of the Temptations, the group that would ultimately become the standard bearers for male vocal harmony worldwide. In the earliest, most formative days of the group, long before the massive crossover pop hits that would define the late 1960s, Paul was the original, undisputed lead vocalist. He possessed a raw, gritty, incredibly powerful baritone voice that was deeply steeped in the Southern gospel tradition. He was the soulful anchor of the group, providing a visceral, emotionally devastating vocal counterpoint to the smoother tenors around him. He was the heart and the absolute soul of their original sound. But his genius extended far beyond the capacity of his vocal cords. Paul Williams was the master choreographer, the visionary who completely revolutionized how black men presented themselves on national television and international stages. Prior to Paul's innovations, vocal groups typically stood static behind stationary microphones, occasionally snapping their fingers or performing basic, rudimentary side steps. Paul completely shattered that static mold. He envisioned dynamic, unified, highly athletic movement that told a story alongside the lyrics. He single-handedly created the legendary Temptation Walk, a smooth, incredibly complex and synchronized stage routine that became the absolute gold standard for every rhythm and blues group that followed. He demanded physical perfection, endless rehearsals, and absolute precision. When the Temptations spun in perfect unison, dropped to their knees, and glided across the stage in tailored suits. It was Paul Williams pulling the strings. He elevated them from mere singers to mesmerizing, untouchable visual icons. His architectural brilliance was not limited to his own group. Berry Gordy, the notoriously demanding founder of Motown Records, recognized Paul's unparalleled ability to command a stage and frequently utilized him as the secret weapon for the entire label. When a young, relatively unknown female trio named the Supremes needed to refine their visual presentation to cross over to white mainstream audiences, Gordy did not hire an external Broadway choreographer. He sent them to Paul Williams. It was Paul who stood in the cramped rehearsal studios of Hitsville, USA, and meticulously taught Diana Ross, Mary Wilson, and Florence Ballard how to move with elegant, captivating grace. He personally choreographed their legendary, iconic routine for the hit single Stop in the Name of Love, dictating the precise, commanding hand gestures that would become permanently etched into the global pop culture consciousness. Paul Williams was quite literally teaching the most famous women in the world how to conquer a stage. The tragic irony of the suicide narrative pushed by the media in August 1973 is that it completely ignores the massive positive momentum Paul had actively generated in the final months of his life. He was not a man sitting in the dark, waiting for the end. He had confronted his demons and was actively clawing his way back to the light. Against immense odds, he had successfully completed a grueling rehabilitation program and had stopped drinking. He was actively shedding the toxic weight of his past. He had just purchased a brand new home symbolizing a fresh, stable start for his family and his future. Most importantly, he was returning to his ultimate passion. He had financed his own time in the recording studio, paying out of his own pocket to record a deeply personal, emotionally raw solo album. He had laid down the vocal tracks for a song titled Feel Like Giving Up, a masterful, haunting performance that proved his baritone voice was still incredibly powerful and capable of deeply moving an audience. Paul Williams, in the summer of 1973, was a man actively rebuilding his empire. He prepared to reintroduce himself to the global market, shedding any image of a broken background dancer to emerge as a triumphant, independent solo artist, surviving the industry's meat grinder. He was cleaning up his ledger, demanding accountability, and preparing to reclaim his rightful place in the industry he had helped build from the ground up. This is the ultimate heartbreaking paradox of the Detroit crime scene. A man who has fought that hard to reclaim his life, who has invested his remaining capital into a new home and a new album, and who has successfully navigated the agonizing process of physical rehabilitation, does not suddenly drive to an empty alleyway in his swimwear and shoot himself with his non-dominant hand after engaging in a violent physical struggle. The media and the police eagerly sold the public a simple story of a broken man giving up. But the physical evidence left inside the Ford Maverick, combined with the undeniable upward trajectory of his personal and professional life in his final days, screams of a forced execution. It suggests a man who was silenced exactly at the moment he was preparing to speak the loudest. The motive behind silencing Paul Williams and the terrifying biological secret that forced his reliance on alcohol lies buried beneath the agonizing physical trauma he endured while building the greatest vocal group in history. The truth behind his demise is intricately tied to a genetic curse, a ruthless corporate assembly line, and a highly profitable system that demanded he literally dance until his blood stopped flowing. The absolute cruelty of the commercial machine that discarded him becomes undeniable only when measuring the sheer physical and creative magnitude of his original blueprint. Far from a mere passenger on the Motown assembly line, he operated strictly as the primary architectural engineer of its golden era. The story begins far from the freezing urban concrete of Detroit, originating instead in the heavily segregated, deeply oppressive environment of Birmingham, Alabama in the 1950s. Paul Williams and his childhood friend Eddie Kendricks formed a musical brotherhood forged in the grueling fires of the Jim Crow South. They were young, exceptionally gifted, and deeply ambitious black men seeking an escape velocity from a society engineered to crush them. They migrated north to the booming industrial heart of Detroit, carrying nothing but their voices and an unrelenting drive to dominate the burgeoning rhythm and blues scene. They formed a group called the Primes, which would ultimately serve as the direct foundational blueprint for the most successful male vocal group in American history. When the Temptations were officially established, stripped of the polished, globally recognized superstar image known today, they operated as a hungry, fiercely competitive quintet fighting for attention in a city overflowing with raw musical talent. In those critical formative years, Paul Williams was the undisputed leader, the primary lead vocalist, and the absolute beating heart of the operation. He possessed a baritone voice that did not just carry a melody, it carried the profound generational weight of Southern gospel. When Paul sang lead on early tracks like Don't Look Back, he did not merely perform the lyrics, he tore them directly from his soul, delivering a highly visceral, emotionally devastating vocal performance that commanded absolute silence from any audience. He was the soulful anchor, providing the necessary gravel and raw emotional depth that perfectly counterbalanced the soaring, angelic falsettos of his bandmates. He was the dominant force on the stage, the man who dictated the energy, the tempo, and the visual standard for the entire group. However, behind the immaculate tailored silk suits, the blindingly bright stage lights, and the seemingly effortless, gravity-defying choreography he had personally invented, Paul Williams was carrying a devastating, deeply lethal biological secret. He was fighting a terrifying, invisible war inside his own veins. Paul suffered from sickle cell anemia. This is not a minor, manageable ailment. It is a severe, hereditary, and incredibly painful blood disorder that predominantly affects people of African descent. In a healthy human body, red blood cells are smooth, flexible, and round, easily gliding through the narrowest blood vessels to deliver vital, life-sustaining oxygen to the organs and muscles. But in a body afflicted with sickle cell anemia, a genetic mutation causes these cells to become rigid, sticky, and violently contorted into the shape of a crescent moon or a sickle. These malformed cells do not glide, they catch, they clump together, and they aggressively block the microscopic capillaries throughout the body. The physical consequences of this microscopic blockage are catastrophic and excruciating. When the sickled cells dam up the blood vessels, the surrounding tissues and organs are immediately and violently starved of oxygen. This sudden oxygen deprivation triggers what medical professionals call a sickle cell crisis. It manifests as a sudden, overwhelming, and highly localized agony frequently concentrated in the chest, the abdomen, and particularly the major joints. The pain is frequently described by sufferers as a sensation akin to having ground glass injected directly into the bone marrow, accompanied by severe crippling fatigue, breathlessness, and a terrifying rapid deterioration of basic physical stamina. It is a condition that requires careful management, frequent rest, specialized medical intervention, and the complete avoidance of extreme physical exertion and high-stress environments. Now place that terrifying biological reality directly into the center of the Motown hit factory in the mid-1960s. The commercial music industry during this era was a ruthless, entirely unforgiving meat grinder. Berry Gordy had constructed a brilliant but highly demanding corporate empire built on a philosophy of constant, unyielding production. The Temptations were not afforded the luxury of seasonal touring or extensive vocal rest. They were thrust into a grueling, incredibly hostile schedule. They spent hundreds of days a year crammed into unair-conditioned buses, navigating the highly dangerous, racially charged territories of the Chitlin Circuit across the Deep South. They performed multiple high-energy shows a day, standing under massive heat-generating theatrical lights in poorly ventilated, overcrowded nightclubs and theaters. The most agonizing paradox of Paul Williams's existence was that the very choreography he had brilliantly invented to elevate the group to global superstardom was the exact physical mechanism actively destroying his failing body. The legendary Temptation walk, the synchronized drops to the knees, the rapid athletic spins, and the continuous high-stepping rhythmic gliding demanded supreme cardiovascular endurance. Paul was expected to hit his precise marks, execute the grueling physical routines perfectly, and sing with absolute full-throated baritone power while his red blood cells were literally clumping together, violently starving his muscles and his lungs of oxygen. Every time he dropped into a synchronized split on the stage, the sickled cells in his joints screamed in agony. Every time he held a long, powerful note under the sweltering stage lights, his lungs desperately fought against the internal blockages restricting his blood flow. He was a man actively suffocating from the inside out, strictly mandated by his corporate handlers to smile, sing, and dance for the paying crowds. The true, unspeakable horror of Paul Williams's physical decline was not merely the biological progression of sickle cell anemia. It was the active, systemic medical malpractice executed under the direct supervision of corporate management. As his red blood cells continually clumped, causing excruciating ischemic pain, a functional medical intervention would have mandated immediate hospitalization and the cessation of all physical activity. The Motown touring syndicate, however, implemented a grotesque, highly improvised form of stage-side palliative care specifically engineered to keep the asset operational. The corporation retained private on-call physicians whose primary objective was not the long-term health of the patient, but the short-term stabilization of the performer. In the cramped, humid dressing rooms of theaters across the country, mere minutes before the curtain rose, these doctors routinely administered high-grade intravenous narcotics and industrial oxygen tanks directly to Williams. This was not a medical treatment. It was a pharmacological override of a dying cardiovascular system. The narcotics forcefully severed the brain's ability to process the agonizing pain signals from his dying joints, while the pure oxygen temporarily hyperinflated his failing lungs. He was literally chemically resurrected every night just to execute the spins and splits that the ticket buyers demanded. The sociopathy of this corporate medical strategy was compounded by a devastating legal reality regarding insurance. Because Williams was suffering from a highly documented pre-existing and terminal genetic condition, the major insurance underwriters flatly refused to cover him on the grueling national tours. Instead of grounding the tour or paying exorbitant premiums out of pocket, the syndicate deliberately chose to run him without a safety net. If his heart had completely failed on stage, or if the oxygen deprivation had caused a fatal stroke mid-performance, the corporation possessed absolutely zero liability coverage for him. They were operating a biologically collapsing human being on the absolute razor's edge of mortality, calculating that the nightly revenue generated by his dancing mathematically outweighed the catastrophic legal and moral risks of working a man to death in front of a live audience. Trapped in this terrifying, inescapable cycle of extreme physical exertion and excruciating, untreated biological pain, Paul Williams turned to the only readily available, highly effective anesthetic he could easily access on the road. He turned to alcohol. This is the crucial, deeply misunderstood truth that permanently shatters the lazy, heavily marketed narrative of Paul Williams as a reckless, partying celebrity who simply drank his career into the ground. Stripped of any hedonistic desire or celebratory impulse, his heavy, constant drinking functioned purely as a desperate survival mechanism against the grueling demands of his own stage show. Alcohol was his crude, desperate, and entirely destructive medication. A heavy bottle of cognac was not a party accessory, it was his pharmacy. He consumed massive quantities of liquor specifically to numb the screaming agony in his joints and to temporarily quiet the terrifying, exhausting physical fatigue caused by his oxygen-starved blood. The alcohol heavily depressed his central nervous system, providing a highly artificial, deeply toxic shield against the sickle cell crises, allowing him to push his failing body back out onto the stage night after night. He was literally utilizing high-proof alcohol to violently force his joints to bend, his legs to spin, and his lungs to expand when his biology was actively demanding that he collapse. He was burning his own liver and his neurological pathways to the ground, simply to generate enough synthetic, intoxicated stamina to execute the choreography that the Motown executives and the millions of adoring fans demanded of him. The most chilling, deeply disturbing aspect of this slow, highly visible self-destruction was the absolute, unyielding complicity of the corporate infrastructure surrounding him. The music executives, the tour managers, and the massive entourage operating the Motown machine were not blind. They were acutely, intimately aware of his severe physical deterioration. They watched him sweating profusely, gasping for air in the dressing rooms, and desperately clutching the bottle just moments before the curtain was raised. They witnessed the excruciating pain in his eyes as he forcefully prepared his failing body for another hour of rigorous athletic choreography. Yet they offered absolutely no genuine medical intervention. They did not halt the tour. They did not suggest rehabilitation or adequate rest. They looked the other way. As long as Paul could stand upright, hit his vocal cues, and execute the spins that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in ticket sales, the industry enthusiastically handed him the bottle. The commercial entertainment complex actively, deliberately weaponized his pain. They recognized that his severe, untreated medical condition required massive self-medication to maintain compliance, and they actively facilitated that toxic dependency to ensure the assembly line never stopped moving. They commodified his physical suffering, treating his failing organs and his desperate alcohol-fueled survival tactics as acceptable overhead costs in the highly lucrative business of selling soul music. Paul Williams was the creative heart and the original soul of the operation, but to the executives analyzing the quarterly earnings, he was simply a biological machine undergoing rapid, aggressive depreciation. When the alcohol finally ceased to mask the agony and the sickle cell anemia began to irreversibly shut down his respiratory and cardiovascular systems, the industry would not offer him grace or gratitude. They would simply initiate a cold, calculated strategy to actively hide his failing body from the public, completely stripping him of his dignity and setting the stage for one of the most humiliating, deeply tragic demotions in the history of American popular music. The grueling, unrelenting environment of the Motown touring circuit was not merely a backdrop for Paul Williams' struggles. It was the active, high-pressure crucible that ultimately shattered his physical and psychological foundation. The true horror of his environment becomes vividly apparent through the specific mechanics of a sickle cell crisis is an acute, terrifying medical event characterized by severe, sudden onset pain, tissue ischemia, and profound physical exhaustion. In a medical setting, the protocol involves rest, hydration, oxygen therapy, and powerful analgesics. On a Motown tour bus in the 1960s, the protocol was to get back on stage, smile for the cameras, and sing until the curtain dropped. The choreography Paul had so brilliantly engineered, the very physical vocabulary that defined the Temptations, became his daily torture. The rapid spins, the deep knee bends, the high-stepping glides, every movement placed extraordinary metabolic demands on a cardiovascular system that was fundamentally compromised. When his malformed red blood cells clumped together in his joints and lungs, the pain was not merely a dull ache, it was a screaming, suffocating agony. Yet the corporate machinery of Hitsville, USA, demanded perfection. The Motown Revue tours were notorious for their punishing schedules, often featuring multiple performances a day, late-night travel, and intense rehearsals in poorly ventilated, segregated venues across the American South. The physical toll on a healthy body was immense. The toll on a body battling sickle cell anemia was catastrophic. As his physical foundation crumbled, his reliance on alcohol evolved from a crude painkiller into a fatal life support system. The Motown infrastructure commodified his toxic dependency, viewing his failing organs as acceptable overhead costs as long as the ticket sales remained high. The psychological devastation of this cycle was profound. Paul was a proud, fiercely talented artist, the original architect of the group's success. Yet, as his health declined and the alcohol took its inevitable toll, he was systematically marginalized within his own creation. The Motown executives recognized that his physical deterioration was becoming a liability, but rather than offering support, they initiated a cold, calculated strategy to replace him while maintaining the illusion of the original lineup. The ascension of David Ruffin to the role of primary lead singer was a significant blow to Paul's ego, relegating the founding voice to the background. But the ultimate indignity, the true mark of the industry's ruthless pragmatism, occurred when Paul's physical condition finally made it impossible to sing and dance simultaneously. In a move that perfectly illustrates the callous nature of the commercial entertainment complex, the management devised a chilling theatrical illusion. They hired Richard Street, a talented vocalist, to stand concealed behind a curtain or off stage during live performances, singing Paul's vocal parts into a live microphone. Out on the stage, under the blinding lights and in front of thousands of screaming fans, Paul Williams, the founding heart of the Temptations, was forced to dance while lip-syncing into a dead microphone. It is difficult to overstate the profound humiliation and psychological torture of that experience. He was reduced to a silent pantomime, a physical prop executing his own choreography while listening to another man's voice broadcast over his own face. The industry had literally squeezed the breath from his lungs and simply piped in a replacement voice to keep the illusion alive, completely stripping him of his artistic dignity. When his physical condition deteriorated to the point where even the lip-syncing became impossible, Paul was forced to officially retire from the group in 1971. One might assume that a founding member of one of the most successful vocal groups in global history would retire to a life of comfortable wealth and security. Instead, Paul found himself facing an inexplicable, entirely manufactured economic prison sentence. Despite selling millions of records, generating massive publishing revenues, and packing arenas worldwide, he was informed that he owed Motown Records a staggering sum, reportedly around $80,000. This was not a tax debt to the government. This was money owed directly to the label. Through a complex, highly exploitative system of advanced loans, recouped tour expenses, opaque accounting practices, and failed business ventures that he was frequently pushed into by management, the financial structure of the industry had bled him dry. He was entirely trapped. He had traded his health, his voice, and his youth to build an empire, and his reward was a ledger stating he was a debtor to the very machine he helped construct. He famously referred to himself during this period as a prisoner of Motown. The label controlled his publishing, his royalties, and his future. He was a highly efficient money printing machine that had been systematically drained of its resources and then presented with a bill for the privilege. Despite the crushing weight of his illness, the humiliation of his forced retirement, and his profound financial ruin, Paul Williams refused to simply fade away. By 1973, he had staged a remarkable, largely uncredited personal turnaround that completely contradicts the tragic narrative surrounding his death. He confronted his demons head-on. He successfully completed a rigorous rehabilitation program and entirely stopped drinking. He fought back against his physical decline, regaining his strength and his focus. He was actively shedding the toxic weight of his past and preparing for a new chapter. He purchased a brand new home, symbolizing a fresh, stable start for his family. Most significantly, he poured whatever limited resources he had left into returning to the recording studio. He paid out of his own pocket to record a solo album, a deeply personal project intended to reintroduce his voice to the world. He laid down the vocal tracks for a song titled "Feel Like Giving Up," a masterful, haunting performance that proved his baritone voice was still incredibly powerful, emotionally resonant, and capable of deeply moving an audience. Paul Williams, in the summer of 1973, was a man actively rebuilding his empire. He was preparing to step back into the spotlight, not as a broken background dancer, but as a triumphant independent solo artist who had survived the absolute worst the music business had to offer. However, the corporate doors remained firmly, maliciously locked. Motown, still holding the exclusive rights to his contract and utilizing his alleged debt as leverage, outright refused to release his solo records. Yet, in a display of cold bureaucratic control, they also refused to release him from his contract to allow him to take his music to another label. He was financially and artistically suffocated. He had done the impossible. He had gotten clean. He had recorded new music. He had rebuilt his life, but the system refused to let him move forward. He was trapped in a legal and financial limbo, completely at the mercy of the executives who had already extracted his best years. This context is absolutely critical when analyzing the chilling anatomy of the crime scene in that Detroit alleyway on August 18th, 1973. A man who has fought that hard to reclaim his life, who has invested his remaining capital into a new home and a new album, and who has successfully navigated the agonizing process of physical rehabilitation, does not suddenly drive to an empty alleyway in his swimwear and shoot himself with his non-dominant hand after engaging in a violent physical struggle. The narrative of the despairing addict simply does not fit the reality of Paul Williams in his final days. Rumors have long persisted in the deep underbelly of Detroit's music history that Paul had reached his absolute breaking point with the Motown executives. Eyewitness accounts suggest he had visited the Motown offices shortly before his death, demanding to be released from his alleged debts and his restrictive contract. There is deep, enduring speculation that Paul, having been a founding member present at the very inception of the company, held intimate knowledge of the label's black books, the unofficial financial ledgers, the opaque royalty structures, and the complex accounting irregularities that governed the cash-heavy music business of the era. If he was threatening to publicly expose the specific financial mechanisms that kept artists perpetually in debt, he was making himself a very dangerous man to a very powerful system. He was no longer a compliant asset. He was a highly motivated, independent liability with intimate knowledge of the empire's foundation. This theory provides a terrifying, highly plausible explanation for the forensic anomalies found inside the blue Ford Maverick. The misplaced weapon, the shattered bottle of Courvoisier, the second bullet, and the inexplicable floral swimming trunks all point away from a quiet suicide and aggressively toward a violently staged execution. It suggests a scenario where Paul was abruptly forced from his home, perhaps after a confrontation, driven to a secondary location, and silenced before he could fully execute his independence. The system that had exploited his talent, weaponized his illness, and systematically drained his finances found it incredibly convenient to accept a narrative of self-destruction, effectively closing the book on a man who knew too much and demanded too much. The hasty, unquestioning closure of the Paul Williams case by the Detroit Police Department leaves a permanent dark stain on the history of American popular music. His story is not merely a tragedy. It is the ultimate evergreen warning about the ruthless, predatory nature of the commercial entertainment industry. He represents an entire generation of black artists in the 1960s and 1970s who generated unprecedented historic wealth for their corporate overseers, only to be cast aside when their physical bodies broke down under the strain or their demands for fair compensation became too loud. Far from a casualty of hedonism, he fell victim to a grueling, unforgiving labor system that demanded physical perfection while entirely ignoring a crippling genetic disease, and a financial structure designed to ensure the artist never truly owned their own labor. The legacy of Paul Williams cannot and must not be defined by the mysterious, violent circumstances of that dark alleyway. At his funeral, as the music industry gathered to mourn the man they had collectively failed, his lifelong friend and bandmate Eddie Kendricks leaned over the open casket. In a moment of profound, quiet grief that spoke volumes about their shared history and the brutal reality of their success, Kendricks kissed Paul softly on the forehead. It was a final, deeply personal farewell to the man who had built the foundation they all stood upon. The immediate aftermath of the discovery in that Detroit alleyway was characterized by a chilling, highly coordinated corporate sterilization of the narrative. When the news of Paul Williams' death broke, the massive public relations machinery of Motown Records instantly mobilized, not to demand a thorough, transparent police investigation into the highly suspicious forensic anomalies, but to aggressively control the damage. The corporate executives understood that a murdered founding member, especially one who had recently demanded financial emancipation, was a catastrophic public relations liability that could trigger federal audits and intense journalistic scrutiny. Therefore, the narrative of the tragic, self-destructive addict was rapidly solidified and distributed to the national press. The official press releases and subsequent media coverage entirely focused on his past battles with alcohol and his departure from the temptations due to poor health, conveniently omitting his successful rehabilitation, his recent real estate purchase, and his completed solo album. The industry effectively buried his reputation alongside his physical body, ensuring that the public viewed his demise as an inevitable personal failure rather than a deeply suspicious, violently executed corporate silencing. This aggressive control of the narrative extended directly into the financial devastation left in his wake. The alleged $80,000 debt that Motown claimed Paul owed did not magically vanish upon his death. It became a heavy, suffocating anchor tied directly to his surviving family. His estate was left in absolute ruin. The man who had co-founded an empire, who had choreographed the routines that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in global ticket sales and merchandising, left his loved ones navigating a complex, highly predatory web of manufactured bankruptcy. The royalties from his massive catalog of hits, the publishing rights to his early contributions, and the residual income from television appearances were entirely intercepted by the corporate ledger to satisfy the phantom debt. His family was essentially punished for his ambition, left to rely on the charity of friends and the quiet, unofficial financial support of a few loyal former bandmates, while the executives who had approved the punishing tour schedules continued to collect massive dividends from his intellectual property. The most profound, heartbreaking casualty of this corporate lockdown was the deliberate, malicious vaulting of his final artistic statements. The solo album that Paul had poured his remaining capital and his newly sober energy into was confiscated and permanently shelved by the label. The master tapes featuring his raw, triumphant baritone vocals were locked away in the Motown archives for decades. The most tragic irony of this suppression involves the specific track titled "Feel Like Giving Up." The label executives and later biographers frequently pointed to this song title as psychological proof of his suicidal ideation, utilizing his own art to validate the narrative of his despair. However, those rare individuals who actually heard the unreleased studio recordings confirmed a completely different reality. The vocal performance on that track was not a weak, defeated whimper. It was a powerful, fiercely defiant roar. It was the sound of a man confronting his darkest moments and singing his way through them with absolute, undeniable strength. By locking that music in a vault, the industry did not just steal his money. They systematically stole his final triumphant voice, ensuring that the public only remembered the staggering, intoxicated man on his final tours, rather than the sober, revitalized artist he had become. To fully grasp why a major entertainment entity might prefer a deceased legend over a living, disgruntled founder, one must examine the dark, often violent underworld of the commercial music industry during the early 1970s. This was an era defined by a massive, largely unregulated influx of cash. The rhythm and blues circuit, the distribution networks, and the independent promotional agencies were heavily infiltrated by organized crime and shadowy syndicate figures. Record labels frequently relied on these dangerous networks to secure radio play through illegal payola, enforce exclusive venue contracts, and handle the massive amounts of untraceable physical currency generated by nationwide tours. In this highly volatile, dangerous ecosystem, an artist demanding a forensic audit of the corporate books was not merely a legal nuisance. They were a direct, existential threat to a massive, highly illegal financial infrastructure. If Paul Williams, possessing intimate knowledge of the company's foundational years, had threatened to publicly expose the dual ledgers, the unpaid royalties, and the predatory loan structures, he would have instantly triggered the defense mechanisms of an underworld that routinely utilized violence to protect its revenue streams. The shattered Courvoisier bottle and the misplaced weapon in that Ford Maverick are the classic, undeniable signatures of an amateur staging designed to cover up a professional silencing. The historical consequences of Paul Williams' death, however, generated a massive, entirely unexpected cultural shockwave that permanently altered the trajectory of the music industry. His tragic, highly suspicious demise served as a dark, horrific catalyst for the surviving artists of his generation. The brutal reality of his financial ruin and his sudden death sent a clear, terrifying message to his peers. Absolute loyalty to the corporate machine guarantees absolutely nothing. It is not a coincidence that in the years immediately following his death, the most prominent artists on the Motown roster initiated aggressive, unprecedented battles for their own creative and financial autonomy. Icons like Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder, who had witnessed the systemic destruction of Paul Williams firsthand, flatly refused to be treated as disposable cogs in the hit factory. They staged massive, historic rebellions against the executives, demanding total control over their master recordings, their publishing rights, and their artistic direction. They fought the grueling legal battles that Paul had initiated, ultimately breaking the absolute power of the studio system. Paul Williams was the brilliant, tragic martyr who absorbed the absolute worst of the industry's cruelty, inadvertently paving the way for the artistic liberation of the entire subsequent generation of rhythm and blues musicians. The final, unvarnished truth of Paul Williams cannot be found in the sterilized police reports or the cold, calculated ledgers of a record label. It is found in the undeniable immortal physical legacy he left behind on the stage. He was a man trapped in an impossible contradiction, cursed with a brilliant, revolutionary creative mind and a fragile, failing biological vessel. He was forced to navigate a profoundly racist, exploitative society that demanded his perfection while offering absolutely no grace for his pain. He weaponized his own suffering, utilizing the very disease that was suffocating him to fuel performances of unparalleled emotional depth. He taught an entire generation of black men how to stand with immense pride, how to move with absolute elegance, and how to command a global stage with unyielding dignity. When Eddie Kendricks leaned over his casket and delivered that final silent kiss, he was not mourning a defeated addict. He was honoring a warrior who had fought a 34-year battle against his own genetics and a multi-million-dollar corporate machine, armed with nothing but his voice and his choreography. The men in the tailored suits may have controlled the bank accounts, and the shadows in the alleyway may have silenced his heartbeat, but they entirely failed to kill his spirit. His genius transcended the exploitation. Today, whenever a pop star executes a synchronized spin, whenever a vocal group moves with absolute fluid precision under the stadium lights, and whenever an artist pours their genuine, unfiltered agony into a microphone, they are walking the exact path that Paul Williams paved with his own blood. The tragedy of his death is permanent and agonizing, but the fierce, fragile beauty of his art remains absolutely invincible.